Well, hey there, Year 11s. We're going to have a look at how the war ended in the period 1969 to 1975. And if you have a look here at this image, the newspaper reports war ends, Saigon surrenders, and South Vietnam surrendered to the communists. So yes, the communists do win on this particular occasion. Also, do you like my new mic? It's got a fuzzy thing on the end. Anyway, let's have a look. Since the Tet Offensive, there had been peace talks that had been trying to take place, and it was difficult to organise this because the Viet Cong, or the South Vietnamese Communists, were seen as this separate negotiating group. So you've got the North Vietnamese Army, you've got the Viet Cong, and they're working together to take on the US and the South Vietnamese. And the South Vietnamese President Thieu, he didn't want them, the Viet Cong, or the South Vietnamese Communists, at these meetings because he felt that this would make them a legitimate group. So if we have a look here at the demands of each side, the US, they wanted the withdrawal of US and North Vietnamese forces from South Vietnam. And they felt that South Vietnam should be left to sort out their own problems without interference from North Vietnam. And the South Vietnamese, well, they also wanted the immediate and unconditional removal of North Vietnamese forces, and they wanted South Vietnam to have one leader. The North Vietnamese, well, they just wanted the US out, and also they wanted President Thieu to resign. The Viet Cong, similar thing, wanted the removal of US forces, and they wanted President Thieu to resign, obviously with the idea then that the North Vietnamese would be able to take over and make Vietnam one country and a communist country at that. So you have this bloke, Richard Nixon, US President in 1969. He says this in a television speech. "My fellow Americans, we have only two choices if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate withdrawal of all US troops without regard to the effects of that action. Or we can persist in our search for a just peace through a negotiated settlement, if possible, through our continued implementation of our plan for Vietnamization. I have chosen the second course. It is not the easy way. It is the right way." So what Nixon's talking about here is this idea that if they withdrew all of the US troops, that would lead to a North Vietnamese victory, and that was not something that they were keen to do. However, in light of all of the protests that were taking place back home, Nixon did say, okay, we'll honour our current defence commitments, but we're not going to commit troops anywhere else. So what does he do? He decides to order the bombing of Cambodia. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army had been using Cambodia as sort of this safe haven, as a springboard for attacks in South Vietnam. We've talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran extensively throughout Cambodia. And despite the fact that Cambodia was a neutral nation, the North Vietnamese Army had been using its territory to run weapons and troops. So Nixon, on his own, without the consent or even the awareness of the Congress, authorizes the bombing of Cambodia in the springtime in America of 1970. And if you have a look here at this map, here we have all of these red dots. They represent the bombs that were dropped. Phnom Penh, the capital there, plenty of bombing right along the borders with Vietnam. And the point for doing that was to try and force the North Vietnamese out, A, of Vietnam, and B, of Cambodia, back up to North Vietnam. And so he says again, the action I have taken is completely necessary for the success of the withdrawal program from Vietnam. A majority of the American people want to keep the casualties of our brave men in Vietnam at an absolute minimum. And so, the invasion of Cambodia is essential if we are to achieve that goal. We take this action for the purpose of ending the war. But to be honest, it just sounds like ending the war. The only way to end the war was to keep the war going. Not probably going to be the most effective solution. The war spread even further in 1971. South Vietnamese troops, with air support from the US, they invaded Laos, which is the country just above Cambodia. And there were 5,000 elite troops sent to destroy parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese Army, however, met them, and they soundly defeated them, and at least half of the South Vietnamese force were killed. If we fast forward through to October 1972, there is a breakthrough in negotiations, and Nixon was happy about this discussion moving forward because it was coming just before the presidential elections, and if the war was to end, this would be a great achievement for Nixon. And so these were the terms of the agreement made. The North Vietnamese, they dropped their demand that President Thieu be replaced by a coalition. It was decided that the North Vietnamese army would remain in the areas that they controlled. The Viet Cong would be allowed to participate in the final settlement. A ceasefire was reached, so everyone was going to stop fighting, and the US agreed to withdraw all of the remaining troops, and all of the US prisoners were to be sent home. Sounds pretty good. Except that President Thieu rejected the agreements because he felt as though the US were about to abandon him. So talks were halted in December, and there were some in the US who even considered, well, maybe we should just assassinate President Thieu in order for us to be able to get these negotiations through. However, in January, the 23rd of January 1973, a ceasefire was signed. Thieu really had no choice but to sign this ceasefire. And so the US was going to leave Vietnam. On the 27th of January 1973, a formal agreement was signed and the war was over. And all parties pledged to respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam. And all of the troops from the US were withdrawn by the 29th of March 1973. At least at this point in time, it seems as though the war has finally come to an end. But President Thieu was right, because shortly after the US left South Vietnam, the ceasefire would collapse, and fighting between the North and the South would resume. Thieu, however, was in an excellent position because of the armaments left by the US. They left a lot of ammunition, equipment. They left it behind for the South Vietnamese forces. And despite losing land and equipment, the North Vietnamese, they decided that they were going to launch a huge attack on the South in December 1974. When this happened, Thieu asked President Ford, so Nixon's gone, we have a new president in America, President Ford, he asked for $300 million and military equipment. And when President Ford decided not to give that to President Thieu of the South Vietnamese, he was infuriated. Because Thieu argued, well, the North Vietnamese, they're being given support from China and from the Soviet Union, other communist countries, and he didn't want the South Vietnamese to be left behind. On the 11th of March 1975, the North Vietnamese won a key victory at a place called Ban Mi Thuot, which is, here it's about halfway down from the border between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and Saigon, the capital city. And so, having lost here, President Thieu ordered his generals to withdraw to the more easily defended coastal cities, so places like Nha Trang and Tu Hoa, all along here. And a lot of refugees actually fled along with the army. So about 1 million refugees fled towards these coastal cities, adding a whole heap of panic and confusion, and essentially the communists were able to drive towards Saigon, following these arrows here, basically unopposed. In the end, with the North Vietnamese coming in, preparing to take over Saigon, President Thieu, his resignation was demanded by all sides, even the US, to make negotiations with the North Vietnamese a whole lot easier. So on the 21st of April 1975, President Thieu resigned and he left the country. South Vietnam was overrun and Saigon was captured on the 30th of April 1975. From there, the government of North Vietnam united both North and South Vietnam on the 2nd of July 1976 to form the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war had, at this point, come to an end completely. So if we have a look at the impact of the war on America, this was the first war that the US had lost. And so there was this real unwillingness to become involved in future conflicts. President Carter, who was president for one term from 1977 to 81, he was a guy who emphasized human rights and he was really keen to solve disputes peacefully. He didn't want America to have to enter into another war. His successor, the guy who came after him, President Reagan, he wanted to make the US the world's leading superpower, and so he challenged, just like presidents before him, challenged the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. After Reagan came George Bush Sr., and the US were involved in the Gulf crisis of 1990 and 91, where Bush led a coalition of forces that drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, if you know anything about the Iraq War, that's the guy that the Americans were after. And so, with this, the Gulf crisis, this gave the US some of the confidence that had been lost in the Vietnam War. For Vietnam, however, well, they became a communist country, and yes, the guy who we should thank for all of this is the bloke Ho Chi Minh. Now, of course, with the outcome still in question, Ho Chi Minh had died in 1969 from heart failure in his home in Hanoi, which was up in North Vietnam. And his embalmed body is currently on display in a mausoleum in, not in Hanoi, rather, it's in Ho Chi Minh City. Despite the fact that his will stated that he wanted to be cremated. You know what? I lied. I've been to the mausoleum. It is actually in Hanoi. What am I saying? The former capital of Saigon, or former capital of South Vietnam, rather, Saigon was officially named Ho Chi Minh City on the 2nd of July 1976. So that's what you'll see it referred to as now. And so Ho's embalmed body is inside this building here. It's modelled after Lenin's tomb in Moscow, and as you can see in the picture, heaps of people line up every day, sometimes for hours, just to walk past his body in silence. I've done this when I went to Vietnam 10 years ago, and yeah, you wait for a really long time, and then you walk into this room, you walk around three sides, his body is, there's a couple of security guards with guns, and you walk around, you walk silently, you have a look, his dead body's just laying there, and then you walk out again. And a number of communist leaders have actually got mausoleums just like this. Lenin, Mao Zedong from China, and then a couple of North Koreans as well, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. So he joins a pretty motley crew of communist leaders who have their bodies there open for viewing from the public. So anyway, that brings us to an end, to have a look at the end of the Vietnam War. A war that really in a lot of ways didn't need to happen and caused a lot of bloodshed. So we're going to have a look at the impact on the American troops in a moment, and the American people, as well as some of the Australians. Then we're going to start having a look at JFK's assassination. Cool.